All right, viewers, Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. Good day and welcome to another unbelievably mind-blowing episode of Global Arena on my YouTube channel, Global Arena TV. I'm your host, Umar Isa Dandago. We begin with a spoiler alert, which says today's introduction is going to be very, very, very funny. And here it goes. Why does Andrew Mueller prefers to present a program heavily focused on foreign affairs? Does he even deserve to host such a mighty show full of complicated complexities? Why does Andrew Mueller treat those very complex international issues in a funny way? And why did it take me, Umar Isa Dandago, the Global Arena icon, at least 1 week or thereabouts to understand Andrew Mueller's captivatingly wordy description of Kim Jong-un? We'll find out. Again, why do Andrew Mueller's explainers sound both harsh and a bit opinionated? Finally, why does Andrew Mueller like describing some globally notable politicians as crook, idiots, certifiable lunatics, tin pot tyrants, dingbats, and so on? Well, to answer these probingly hard-hitting questions from me, I am joined by the guy himself, and I promise you, he has nowhere to hide. Andrew Mueller joins me now from the UK. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the show.
Absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, you're welcome. The pleasure is mine. For our viewers, Andrew Mueller is a contributing editor to Monocle Radio and the presenter of the Foreign Desk and Foreign Desk Explainers. He joins me via Zoom from London. Thank you very much once again for coming on the show. I suppose you are at home. You're not at Maduri House, where you produce the Foreign Desk and other Monocle Radio programs, right?
Yeah, I am at home right now. It's Sunday, which is one of the few days a week I don't have to go into Maduri House to make radio programs. So yes, welcome to my spare room.
Definitely, and it looks great. It looks beautiful. I like the background over there. It looks like a drum or something. There's a picture behind you by the left, above the.
It's the framed cover of the Australian edition of one of my books. The idea was that it's actually supposed to be a hand grenade with a map of the world on it. It's not a terribly subtle metaphor.
Wow, that's great. So it's a pleasure, and there's a shelf. I think a couple of books over there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are just magazines and so on that I have written for. The black ones are all. Sorry, I'm trying to get my hand in. The black ones are all Monocle magazine.
Oh, that's great. So you are a writer. That's maybe the part that I've missed, and the other part, which is a musician. With this music, you're a musician as well. So you're going to sort of unpack them in your introduction. So I think the first question I would like to ask you is, who is Andrew Mueller? I think the short funny introduction that I've made is not enough, does not suffice for my viewers to know who exactly is this Andrew Mueller that I have been talking about for long.
Your introduction pretty much covered it in terms of what I do now. As you said, I'm a contributing editor at Monocle, but I also work for the magazine's radio station, Monocle Radio. I present the Foreign Desk. Most days when I'm in London, I also present the Monocle Daily, which is a daily current affairs discussion program, and I do other bits and pieces as well. So that's pretty much what I do now. But yeah, I'm a journalist basically, and that's all I've ever done. I've been doing it a very long time now. I started doing it in Sydney, Australia, which is where I'm from, when I was very, very young. And many years later, I'm still somehow making a living at it, for which I'm very, very grateful.
So why journalism? Why not academia? Why is it that we're not saying Professor Andrew Mueller?
The best answer I can give to that is that I don't know. I never really thought of doing anything else. I like the idea of a job that would be something different every day, a job that would mean you were always learning things, a job that would mean you were always meeting people, and a job that ideally would mean that you were able to, go and see a bit of the world. And it has proved to be all those things. I've been very, 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 very lucky. But I mean, yeah, from the time I was, I think from about my teenage years onwards, I think I kind of understood that this was probably what I wanted to do. And I really couldn't think of anything else that I actually was qualified to do. I mean, I've always thought that the best journalists, the best other journalists I've known, to be the people who ended up in the job because, well, a combination of those two things. They discovered that they weren't actually terribly suited to anything else, and also it didn't really occur to them to do anything else. Yeah, this is, it's a hard question to answer because in many ways it doesn't really feel like it was a decision I ever made. It was just always what was going to happen, and indeed it has.
So maybe as people who are more religiously inclined would say it's fate, destiny, right?
Perhaps, I don't know. I'm not really much for fate or destiny myself, but I mean, I've been very, very lucky along the way as well. A lot of things have just kind of broken for me at exactly the right time. If I was a more superstitious person, I might read something into that, but I think I've just mostly been incredibly fortunate.
So how old is Andrew Mueller? 60 plus?
Well, clearly I'm aging badly. No, I'm 55.
Wow, that's great. And I think you are a celebrity because you have over 10,000 subscribers. No, 10,000, 11,000 followers on Twitter alone. I'm not on Instagram, so I cannot speculate. And
neither am I.
You have a profile on Wikipedia. Mostly is for celebrities, those who are highly notable, I think.
I think the profile on Wikipedia is very short. I have no idea who thought it was a useful allotment of their time to write it, and I think last time I looked at it, it's mostly wrong. So I wouldn't get too excited about that.
So why can't you go and fix it?
I think they frown on people editing their own entries, and quite rightly.
Yeah, definitely. So the next question is, why foreign affairs? Why is it that you're always interested in foreign global stuff? Not some Australian local issues. Why is it that?
It didn't really start out like that. I started out writing about music. I was a rock journalist. I worked for a Sydney street paper called On the Street, and then I worked for a British rock magazine called Melody Maker. Really what changed it, though, was randomly buying a book when I was a young man backpacking in Ireland. And the book was called Holidays in Hell, and it was by an American writer called P.J. O'Rourke. And it was a book about serious things. It was a book, he was a journalist, he worked for Rolling Stone magazine, and it was a book about wars and revolutions and so on, but they were funny stories about wars and revolutions and so on. He was a humor writer. He'd worked for National Lampoon, and he thought it would be interesting to apply the techniques of being a funny humor writer to serious international affairs. And I think that kind of got in my head. I mean, the book just made me absolutely howl with laughter. So there was that. But I think at some level, I thought if there was a way you could apply some of the qualities of rock journalism to being a foreign correspondent, the idea that, you know, you could be a bit irreverent, that you could have a bit of fun with it, that you could take a slightly iconoclastic approach to the subject and to the personalities. I think that kind of got in my head. And I think even at that point, I realized that, you know, you can't, well, most people can't be a rock journalist forever. It's something you do in your 20s mostly, though I do still write the odd record review here and there. But I just thought I will want to do something else at some point, and maybe this is it, and maybe this is a way I could do it.
All right, that's why you have chosen this path of covering mostly the most contentious political issues of our generation in the world, for example. And maybe another question is, I mean, how on earth is it that you prefer treating some of those complex global issues in a humorous way? For example, we could notice that in your interview shows that the Monocle Daily, and especially the Foreign Desk, and even in your Foreign Desk explainers, you use humorous language, but you don't laugh. And there are some special effects that you put in the audios also, which accompany the humor. I mean, why this?
The special effects you mentioned are the work of one of the Foreign Desk producers, Christy O'Grady. And a lot of the times when I write those scripts, I mostly feel like I'm trying to make Christy laugh. I'm trying to set up things that will give her ideas about, you know, interesting noises and sounds that she can put in it to keep it bouncing along. the answer to, like, I'll start that thought again. The reason for the humorous approach, I think, is twofold. One is that I think it just comes naturally. It may be a massive character defect. I just have a very, very hard time taking a lot of serious things terribly seriously. Sometimes I think that's maybe not just me. I think it's possibly a product of where I come from. Australians such as my... We're a funny people, but we're also, I think, we're very suspicious of people and ideas that take themselves seriously. I think our default response is to sort of is to laugh at things. It's not necessarily. Sometimes it's a good thing and sometimes it's a bad thing, but it is what it is. I think we are inclined to look for what amuses us in a given situation. It may be some sort of coping mechanism, but I also think it's a good way to tell a story. People like listening to a funny story. If people are laughing, they're also listening.
But they will not take it seriously. When you are talking, for example, about a coup in West Africa, for example, or about let's put it this way, with the crisis in the Middle East, the war happening in Gaza, for example, or some very serious issues in the US politics, and then you put humor, you include humor, would that make it as serious as it is?
I don't think people take the reporting or the story any less seriously just because you found some humor in it, and I think. And I do think humor, when it lands, it's a relief as well. It gives people a room to breathe, because you can, especially now when you can spend your entire day plugged into the news cycle. People can get extremely, I think, genuinely quite stressed and unhappy and alarmed. And I think there's sometimes it's okay to remind people that everything's not terrible. And sometimes it's okay to remind people that, a lot of the things that we do cover, and they are often terrible, serious things. And to be clear, I would not make light of something like what is occurring in Gaza. There's nothing funny about any of that. It's awful and it's terrible. But that said, you can look at any situation and there will be, for example, in that case, that there are personalities directing events in Gaza, which it's perfectly reasonable to make fun of and send up, because like they are somewhat...
Like Mahmoud Abbas, who you call crook.
Yeah, it's right there. And you mentioned the example of the United States, and for all that the prospect of Donald Trump being re-elected is alarming at a number of levels, I also get the thing of, like, how can you look at this man and not laugh? He's ridiculous. And I feel a bit pompous saying this, because it's a slightly pompous thing to say, but I've reported a lot in places which have been run by proper authoritarians. And I'm not including Donald Trump in that, because I don't think, fundamentally, I just don't think he's that organized. But I think he has something in common with them, in that there is nothing that the tyrant fears laughter more than they fear anything else. The thing that keeps any dictator awake at night is the idea that people are laughing at them. It is a fundamentally humorless business. Donald Trump, for example, I suspect has next to no sense of humor whatsoever. And I think that is something that all demagogues and would-be demagogues do have in common. And so it can be, and again, this is an incredibly pompous thing for somebody in my extremely privileged position to say, but it can be used, I think, as a weapon against them.
Are you saying this as Andrew Mueller, a journalist, or Andrew Mueller, or an analyst, for example, saying all those stuff about Donald Trump?
Well, both. But the thing is with Donald Trump particularly, and this is honestly a frustration I'm finding in trying to. I mean, this is the third time he's run for president, and the trouble is with Donald Trump, the only things you can say about him are the obvious things. There's never anything new to say. It's been the same story now for however long he's been doing this, and it's really hard to keep finding new ways to point out the very obvious deficiencies in his character.
Oh, so are you trying to say that Donald Trump has no anything good about him, for example, except those stuff?
Genuinely, I find this interesting about the phenomenon, not necessarily interesting about him, because the thing I keep coming back to with Trump is it's not just a question that I don't agree with most of his politics. I don't, and that's fine, that's allowed. It's just that there's lots of people, for example, whose politics I disagree with, but I think they're probably not bad people. I think, I can think that they are decent, they are reasonable, they are kind, they are humble. They just think about things differently than how I do, and that's absolutely fine. But Donald Trump is interesting in that I at least genuinely struggle to find a single redeeming quality to him. I mean, if you think of all the bad things that any man can be, I mean, he's all of them. I mean, he's a crook, a cheat, a liar, a coward, a bully, a blowhard, and on and on and on it goes. I'm kind of astonished that of all the people in the United States they could have built a personality cult around, they've built it around him of all people.
And aren't we supposed to be neutral, objective, impartial when we are reporting stuff? We tend, we journalists nowadays tend to be so harsh on Donald Trump. I mean, we're missing something. Aren't we fair?
I understand what you mean about impartiality and objectivity. It's a tricky one, because I think it's a worthy aspiration, and I certainly think you should be open to seeing all sides of a given story. That's fine, but also I tend to be a bit suspicious of anybody who does proclaim their impartiality, because everybody's partial, because you can't possibly cover every single aspect of a story in a half-hour radio program or 1,000-word article or whatever. You're partial not just in what you say or write. You're partial in what you don't say and don't write. You're partial in what you decide not to include in the story. And in terms of Trump, at Monocle Radio, I think over the last 8 years we've been very good at making sure we have lots of American conservatives on the program, but they tend to be sort of proper old school, sensible American conservatives. With Trumpers, I would always be open to interviewing a pro Donald Trump voice or having them on one of our shows, but I'm not really interested.
Don't get them. You normally don't invite them to speak, especially those who are hard. What's the word for it? Like the die-hard fans of Donald Trump. You don't get them on the show to
no.
Protect
The tricky bit about that is I would be perfectly happy to have one on the show. It's just very hard to find one who will just actually engage in a conversation rather than sort of announcing culture war bumper stickers instead of having a conversation. It's genuinely very difficult. If anyone wants to suggest the reasonable, thoughtful Trump fan we can talk to, I'd be absolutely happy to.
May I suggest a name?
Go on.
Vivek Ramaswamy. Yeah.
We may be operating on different criteria of reasonable and thoughtful, and also I'm not sure we'd get him.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah, sure, definitely. All right. If that is the case, then let's move on, since he's not the type of person that you would feel comfortable having an interview with. But he's pro-Trump, and he can, how can I say, passionately defend Trump right now. I know. So let's move on. How great is it being a foreign correspondent? You told us earlier that you have reported throughout your life from countries ruled by dictators, for example. Can you take us through your career as a foreign journalist and the places that you have visited, and especially those countries that you said were ruled by dictators, for example? How great was it? Has it been for you?
Fascinating, really, really interesting. I've reported, when I talk about places like that, I'm thinking of Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Gaddafi's Libya, Afghanistan under the Taliban, one or two others. But I've reported from various kind of conflict zones as well: Israel, West Bank, Gaza, Northern Ireland, Lebanon, various others. I mean, everywhere you go as a journalist is interesting. There's always something to learn about a place you've never been to before. And ideally, when you go back to a place you have been to before, you're better positioned to know it better, because there'll be people there'll be places you'll have better informed questions. It's always been my favorite part of the job, the actually going places and seeing things, because. And again, I referred to P.J. O'Rourke, who wrote that book Holidays in Hell, which was such an inspiration. He wants to find journalism as a way of getting paid to do things that you would pay to do if you hadn't figured out how to get paid for doing them. And that's always been what it's like for me. It's just there's always that double level of delight. You're thinking, okay, this is amazing. I'm here. I'm in this place, getting to see this stuff. And also somehow this is my job. That never gets old, that stuff. It's always interesting going to somewhere you've never been before, seeing what you can find out and having to explain it to your readers or your listeners. Yeah, great fun.
Definitely. So, I don't know, but is it fair for a white man from Australia, from London, from Washington, D.C. to travel to a continent where he has zero experience of, he has never been to, he has zero connection to as well, a report from, for example? Do you think there's a kind of imbalance, something like that?
The short answer to that question is no, it's not fair at all. The longer answer is that I think it's better than it was. The social media environment means that we do now hear voices directly from the places. It also means, and I think this is good, that we are accountable to those people as well. Like, 30 years ago, you could go to country X, you could write whatever you liked for your newspaper back home, and who would ever know? But now you write the thing for your newspaper back home, the people in country X, they're going to read it. And if they think you've got it wrong, I promise you from personal experience, they will let you know all about it. And so they should. That is absolutely how it should work. The value, I think, and again, trying not to sound pompous, of the model you described, i.e. white bloke from Australia or Washington or London or wherever swans around the Middle East or Africa or wherever else and explains it to the people back home. The way that can work and the way that can be a good thing is you go in there thinking, I'm sort of here as a representative of my readers back home. I'm trying to figure out, what would somebody who wants to know about this place want to know? How would I explain this to them? And I'm sure I have made misjudgments, but I don't think I've ever written anything purporting to say that this is the definitive, omnipotent, all-seeing analysis of what's going on here. I always try to be mindful that all this is what I saw and what I heard, and it's what I think. And that it may be a million miles from the truth, but it's the truth as I saw it and as I understood it. So I think the way it works now, I think balance is improving, because I think there is a value to being that person who goes to a place and explains it to the people back home. And it goes both ways. I think there would be huge value, for example, in a reporter from Nigeria going to Australia and writing about that for their readers back in Nigeria. That's absolutely fine. There should be way more of that kind of thing. And I'd be fascinated to read that story as an Australian. But the fact is that now voices from those places can be heard. And that's a huge improvement to our understanding of the world, I think.
Yes, and one critical part of the conversation is that the problem that we're having is that you may be using your own Western lens and prism when analyzing other these complex issues. And that's why you called Andrew Mueller, in one of your explainers recently, you have called the Taliban as quote unquote unlettered misogynist jerks. Let's, for the sake of our audiences, play this clip.
Just as the Taliban were unlettered misogynist jerks then, they're unlettered misogynist jerks now, and this is most of the reason they were not in Doha.
Well, as a matter of...
I mean, you heard this clip, right?
Yeah, that's me.
All right, Andrew Mueller, talking about Taliban. Do you regret calling the Taliban misogynists, unlettered jerks?
Well, no, I think that's a pretty reasonable characterization. I mean, I did see their regime up close in the first time around in the late 1990s when I went to Afghanistan. I can't see any basis for their treatment of women beyond just a furious hatred of women. Unlettered. Okay, possibly a bit harsh.
So now you regret calling?
No, I think it's. I find it very difficult to make excuses for or agree that there is any context for. It's none of it's actually necessary. There's no reason at all why the women of Afghanistan could not participate fully in the life of Afghanistan, and the Taliban have made a decision that they won't permit that.
But the thing is that, Andrew Mueller, you're using your Western Australian lens and prism, let me put it again, to judge Afghanistan, a country totally located geographically, totally from Australia, far away from London where you live. Isn't it a bit unfair to use your own compass to describe, to analyze, to pass judgment on the people of Afghanistan?
I wasn't passing judgment on the people of Afghanistan because the people of Afghanistan who I met in my visits there were mostly delightful, extremely friendly, pleasant, incredibly hospitable people. I was passing judgment on the people who run Afghanistan. I mean, it's possibly unfair, maybe, but I don't think it's any more or less unfair than the judgments any of us make based on how we grew up and where we come from. I mean, a member of the Taliban, for example, if they went to Australia, would probably have fairly harsh things to say about Australia. And that's fine. But in this particular instance, I happen to think I'm right and they're wrong.
All right. Don't you sound like an activist, not a journalist, when you say this, for example? Not only this, but when you pass judgment, like sort of in most of your explainers, for example, calling Mahmoud Abbas as an elderly crook, calling Mohammed bin Salman as impetuous thug, for example, Netanyahu as somebody who's in cahoot with certifiable lunatics. I mean, aren't you just...
Well, again, where am I wrong?
Okay, prove to me, to my viewers, that all those things that you said, you've not met them up. You're not like insulting them. You're just saying the facts as a journalist.
I think all those descriptions you recite are readily reinforceable with a few seconds of Googling. Obviously it is my opinion of them, but again, that's fine. That's why my name is at the end of it, because it's my opinion. They're equally entitled to their opinions of me, but I suspect none of them really spare me that much thought.
Yeah. In the second episode, I'm sure we're going to break down into pieces your explainers, and I've got a couple of audios to play later. But I think towards the end of this episode, let me put this question to you. There is the rise of this issue of solution journalism. A lot of people are advocating that we should be looking at the positivities, at good things about the world. We should be reporting about solutions, peace, and so on and so forth. Journalism is heavily criticized for being too focused on problems, catastrophes, war, famine, both natural and man-made. Let's take a look at some quotes that I've got from the internet. Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel laureate in economics, says, and I quote, this quotation is attributed to him: the media sells stories. The media in plural sells stories, and stories are about deviation from normality. Negative deviations are more interesting than the positive ones. Another one that is connected to this guy, Noam Chomsky, he says, and I quote, too often the media serve as a tool for those in power to amplify conflicts rather than a force for resolution. It's attributed to Noam Chomsky. So the question is, don't you think that we should be blamed for fanning the flames of conflicts and violence by simply excessively reporting the violence, the wars, the conflicts, the way we do now?
Short answer, yes. There's a longer answer, but I think I think yeah, it's a perfectly reasonable and accurate suggestion that the media tends to amplify the negative. And I do think this is one of the reasons that social media drives people crazy, because most of what gets on the news or gets on social media is by definition exceptional, and people are drawn to conflict, people are drawn to tragedy, because it's interesting and it's unusual. If it wasn't unusual, it wouldn't make the news. It's like that old joke about how, you never read a newspaper article saying aeroplane lands safely. But the trouble is, but it's true. And the trouble is the consumers of the media are responsible for that as well, because the media is a business. It is serving up what it knows people will respond to. It's very hard to get people interested in solutions focused media, because it's easy to cover problems. It's easy to point out what a problem is. You can say, here is this bad thing, here's whose fault it is, etc., etc., etc. Solutions tend to be really complicated and kind of tedious and technical, and it's very, very hard to keep people focused on that. In defense of Monocle magazine, and certainly with the Foreign Desk, and I know we're going to come to that, it is one of the things we ask ourselves about every episode. We try to avoid shows where you just spend half an hour saying this is happening and it's awful and isn't everything terrible. We do always try to include, okay, well, who is trying to fix this, or how is this fixable, and who can we ask about that? And I think that is quite interesting. But yeah, it's the problem is as well that I think for both journalists and I think consumers of the media, problems and crises are much more easy to explain in a gripping and exciting way than the solutions are.
All right. So I understand that from your explanation that it's not only the journalists that should be blamed for focusing heavily on the doom and gloom of the world. It's also about the consumers. If you always report issues like good issues, like a plane safely landed, nobody would buy the newspaper.
But it's absolutely true when.
Yes.
And okay, I'm biased in favor of journalism and the media because I'm a journalist who works in the media. But whenever I read people talking about how terrible journalists are and how terrible the media is, it's just, well, who consumes it? Who creates the market? If there was a market for densely researched, 10,000 word features about solutions to crises and wars, then people would be happy to print them. But I think you'd bankrupt yourself pretty quickly if that's what you specialized in.
Definitely, you're right. Let's move on briefly to the issue of objectivity and impartiality before we land safely at Maduri House to talk about the Foreign Desk. The issue of objectivity and impartiality, looking at how journalists operate right now in the UK and in the US, and perhaps I think in Australia, though I'm not an expert in Australia, I don't know much about it. You tell me because you're from Australia, but I like it. It's a very beautiful country. I really like it. How dangerous is it, or otherwise, is it to live in a world where mostly quote-unquote opinionated journalism is what is more popular nowadays than the conventional impartial, objective, neutral journalism that you were taught at school perhaps?
Well, the thing is, again, it's a bit like I was saying earlier. I'm not altogether sure that journalism was ever entirely neutral. I mean, all all institutions, and that includes all newspapers, all magazines, all broadcasters, have their institutional biases. There tends to be a worldview, and that's not a bad thing. That means that's how you gather readers and writers and listeners and viewers around you, because they understand that this will probably, reflect my interests. The trouble, of course, is then that people do get locked in their little self-reinforcing silos, and they don't get ideas from elsewhere, some of which, can be valuable and can be useful. What has changed is, and I am old enough that I can remember the media before the internet, so it was very restricted, it was very limited. And that, on the one hand, was bad because it did mean that there wasn't a huge diversity of opinion, and there wasn't a huge diversity of outlook or huge diversity in what got covered. But on the upside, it did mean that societies tended to have, there tended to be general agreement on fundamentals in some respects. I think that makes sense. The good thing now is, of course, that the barriers to entry to the media marketplace have been massively lowered. More or less anybody with a smartphone can have a go at it and find an audience. Yeah. The trouble with that is, as a lot of people have noticed, the best way to attract an audience is to be extreme. It is to be outrageous. It is to just, plain make stuff up. And the other advantage of just plain making stuff up is that it's really cheap. Mm. This is another problem that conventional media has. It's that old, it's a quote variously attributed to Jonathan Swift or Mark Twain, that the lie is halfway around the world before the truth has got its boots on, and that's true. And it is really frustrating. You see it happen on social media all the time. I'm sure you've seen it as well, that something is happening and then angry people on social media saying, why isn't the BBC covering this? And the answer is probably because the BBC is trying to find out what's actually going on, or if this is a thing or actually a story at all, before it actually says, here is the story. And that it takes time. That's tricky. So it is hard for, I guess, what you might think of as serious actual reported media to keep up. But I do think / hope that there is a big enough audience for it that it will keep finding a way to function.
Definitely. Andrew Mueller, this is the end of part one. It's a pleasure having you on the show, Andrew Mueller. Thank you very much for answering those questions. And I hope I haven't been as harsh and hard as you normally are sometimes.
No, I mean, absolute maxim for any journalist. If you are going to dish it out, you have to be prepared to take it. That's absolutely fine.
Definitely. So this is the end of part one. And viewers, stick around. We are coming with another much more interesting episode with Andrew Mueller. So stick around and see you very soon.